So the last thing I want to touch on very briefly, drawing on a lot of this work that we learned from the social influences, just now thinking about robots perhaps themselves as a new kind of communication media. So all the work with Leo is all about the intelligence of Leo, and it's autonomous, and it's learning, and it's doing all this stuff. But what if the robot really is just like a cell phone? So you are communicating to another person through the robot, but in this very embodied, co-located, multimodal kind of way. And why is that interesting? Well, we all know from, cell phones and teleconferencing systems, you miss a lot of what goes on in face-to-face interaction. And your trust and liking and engagement and persuasiveness is often compromised if you interact with somebody, especially for the first time, when you're not face-to-face versus when you make that first contact face-to-face. So this is an example of posture mirroring, of the role of touch, of gesture. You lose a lot of that in our current communication technologies that we use to communicate with each other across distance. But with a robot, you can bring a lot of this back. So this is the Huggable. This is a robotic teddy bear that we've been developing at the Media Lab, looking at a robot as a distance learning technology for children. So an educator, a parent, a grandparent can sort of jack into this robot a la, Diamond Age Raptor style to interact. So Dan is playing the role of a child. Imagine Dan is 8, But playing the role of a child where you can read a book together, you could have tactile, playful interactions. I mean, basically the robot's in your world. And especially for very young children, that's how they learn. I mean, they learn by co-located, co-present, face-to-face interactions that are very concrete in the world. So a robot can bring that to you. So the Huggable, in many ways, is a very sophisticated robot. This is basically the Raptor idea here, where this little video is just giving you a flavor of the kinds of interfaces we've been developing and the interactions. So, a lot of people have built like these robotic toys, and they're really boring, they just don't have very interesting behavior. The power of this idea is it could be grandma on the other side, and you have all of this shared experience and knowledge of grandma that can be channeled through this cuddly little form factor. In the case of an educator, there's been lots of studies showing a difference between if children are learning from an adult who might be intimidating, or they might feel restricted in their exploration because they don't want to look dumb, versus peer-to-peer learning. So this robot puts all of that human expertise in this cute, cuddly little form factor that could really, you can imagine, change the social dynamic between a child and how they learn with the Huggable versus a child and how they learn with an adult. It could explore totally different learning paradigms where it's more of a peer-to-peer. Maybe the child will be much more open to exploration, making mistakes and so forth than they might with an adult. So it's intriguing to think about, in this case, robots is just a new kind of communication medium applied to a lot of different applications, I think. So I think then to recap, I want to just talk about some various trends that are kind of alluded to in the talk, but what robots might be, what roles they might be in the future. And I think, the first lesson that we're already starting to see now is, I think robotics, like a lot of computer technologies, you can imagine it will be ubiquitous in the case that things that you interact with, you might not necessarily think of as being a robot, but it is incorporating robotic technology. So the Roomba is a key example of that. If you talk to Roomba owners, they don't think of this as being a robot, they just think of it as being a vacuum cleaner, but autonomous vacuum cleaner. Similarly, when you think about cars in the United States, we have these DARPA Grand Challenge and DARPA Urban Challenge of these autonomous driving vehicles. Arguably, cars are becoming more and more like robots every year. They have a lot of computation, a lot of sensing. Things like automatic braking are happening kind of beyond what the human is doing. And now with autonomous vehicles, a lot of major car manufacturers are starting to see autonomous cars as the future of urban driving. And that could fundamentally transform the relationship of the car to the driver when the car no longer is a tool that you operate, but is a partner that you interact with. A car that might understand your driving goals, what you're trying to accomplish by being in the car, your preferences of music and so forth. So it could transform our relationship that we have with this sort of robot that's basically your car. So I think this is one trend that you're going to continue to see. And this is just a funny movie of 2004. You remember these iMac commercials when the iMac first came out? Maybe your computer will be a robot, and So again, just to highlight, it doesn't have to be anthropomorphic. You saw a lot of anthropomorphic robots. It does not have to be anthropomorphic to get this sort of social thing going. And I think that's important to remember. The other, I think, application, you're already starting to see it. This is the InTouch Health telepresence robot, which a doctor can visit a hospital remotely as a robot, essentially, to visit patients and nurses and other doctors at a remote facility through this sort of robotic telepresence. In Japan, people like Hiroshi Ishiguro are taking this to an extreme where he's created an android in his likeness. And he tells stories. So Hiroshi actually holds 2 appointments. He is a professor at the University of Osaka, and he works at ATR, which is a big Japanese kind of technology lab in Japan. And he talks about using, he calls it the Geminoid, to interact with his students while he's still at ATR. So your advisor never leaves, he's always there. You're starting to see, the makers of Roomba have now stuck a camera on the Roomba to look at sort of this remote surveillance, but of course telepresence. And even these little, this is Keepon. I love this robot. This is a robot that was developed in Japan by Hideki Kozuma. That's being applied as a therapeutic tool in autism. So for children who are on the autism spectrum, having children interact with this little cute, unintimidating thing in order to learn skills like joint attention and so forth. So robots as a therapeutic tool to help people learn and acquire and improve their social communication skills, I think, is another really intriguing area. And then, a lot of my talk was really, of course, talking about the partner robot. And I think, of course, this is further off. I think you're already starting to see, examples, of course, of the other two. Pero, in some senses, is maybe the simplest kind of social robot technology. This is a steel robot developed in Japan that they've been deploying in elder care facilities, showing that this sort of soft, fluffy, kind of animate, like steel robot can help improve the sort of emotional experience of elders with dementia. So looking again as a sort of therapeutic quality of life application where those people with dementia, they can't take care of a real pet, but they can interact and get a lot of the benefits of touch and so forth, the companion animals, with a robot. So this is a simple version of that, but of course you can imagine the trajectory going up from there. So I'm going to start to do some wrap-up here. I mean, I think one thing that's an important takeaway from the work is not just thinking about what robots will be in the future in terms of applications and how they're going to affect your life, but really if you think about the scientific side of this work, it's really through the process of trying to build these robots and taking inspiration from psychology, neuroscience, and natural systems, we learn a lot about ourselves as well. So, this is a very old human story. We've been trying to build robots and machines on our image for hundreds of years, thinking about it for thousands of years. And I think it's just a profound human quest of going through this process in order to think about and reflect upon ourselves and what it means to be human and what it means to be human in the future. So robots as a scientific tool and a tool for reflection, I think, continues to be a strong theme of this work, and I think a role of robotics in many years to come. And then finally, I just want to wrap up with, I started this talk talking about Star Wars and how I was inspired to do this largely because I saw this movie as a young kid, and life has a way of coming back in loops. So because I saw Star Wars as a kid, I developed Kismet. And Kismet was a robot that was finished right around the time of the movie AI. And there was actually an article about Kismet in Time magazine, and one of the producers saw that article and called me up and invited me to consult on the movie as a sort of scientific bridge during the promotional phase. So I didn't actually advise on the movie itself, but I was basically there to help field questions from the press about the themes of the movie. I don't know how many people saw this movie, but this is the Kubrick-Spielberg film about a robot boy who could love. And in that movie, of course, the robot that I loved was Teddy. Teddy was a great character. And through that, I met Stan Winston. And when I met Stan, I told Stan, I had just finished building Kismet. I said, we should build Teddy, but we should really build Teddy. And that's what became Leonardo. So in many ways, Stan and I shared the same vision, the same dream, in that Stan, coming from performance and Hollywood and special effects, his dream was to build a real character. What he meant by that is that robots in the movies, like Teddy here, I mean, they're just puppets. They're only brought to life on the screen by a whole team of puppeteers who are controlling all these degrees of freedom and stuff. So Teddy had like 40 points of motion. Stan's dream was to build Teddy that had a life and existence off the set, too. That's exactly the vision that I had for Kismet through C3PO and R2D2. I mean, robots with personality, persona that transcended the set. So I started this great collaboration with Stan, of course, is a legend in Hollywood, and unfortunately we lost him to cancer way too early. But the dream continues. And then it turns out that a couple years ago, Lucasfilms teamed up with the Boston Museum of Science to create a show called Star Wars, where science meets imagination. So many of the artifacts from the original Star Wars movies were brought to science museums, and this was a touring show across different cities and I think different countries, where I actually was asked to consult and participate in this exhibition. And there was this one thing called the Robot Theater, where I basically was like a character in this theater. But I had this sort of interaction with C3PO, so I actually met Anthony Daniels, who's the actor who played C3PO. And incidentally, Anthony Daniels is the only human who actually appeared in every single movie. The only human actor appeared in every single movie. So it was a great thrill for me to meet Anthony Daniels. And you'll see in that theater performance, there was Kismet. So this isn't the actual Kismet robot, but it was a mock-up. But it was kind of like, again, this sort of closing the loop of seeing Star Wars as a little girl and actually consulting on this movie and actually getting to meet George Lucas himself. So it's just kind of a nice story of how these things come around to circle. And then the last thing I want to highlight is, who are building these robots with me? They're students. They are undergraduate and graduate students. They're not, people who are 80 years old, 50 years old doing this. I mean, they're people. They're not a lot older than a lot of you. And I think, again, if you're willing to pursue your dreams and use your imagination to be creative, you're capable of so many things. So this is just to acknowledge all the really brilliant, hardworking, creative students that I work with and couldn't have brought these robots to you and talk to you without their help. And so with that, I'm going to end.
I think you'll agree that was absolutely fascinating. What would you say if I told you that actually Cynthia is an android? And that the real Cynthia is going to walk through that door any minute. You can see what I mean when I spoke to her on radio today, why I believe that in the not too distant future, I imagine we probably will, well, not quite marrying robots, but certainly be living with them. Several things. We're going to take questions, so if anybody has any questions, please put your hand up. Lovasus, first of all, and we'll get a microphone to you. But as I was watching that, as you went on and on and on, you were answering every question I wanted to ask you. When you were talking about the obesity, I was wondering, did the people who were taking part in this experiment, were they all women, first of all, or were they women and men? And then were all of the voices on the robots that you put into these homes in Boston, were they all male voices, or were they all female voices?
Yeah, so the subject pool that we got for the weight management study were recruited at the Boston Weight Loss Clinic. So Dr. Carolyn Apovian is a preeminent authority in weight management at Boston University who was an advisor on the project. It just turned out that 80% happened to be women. We would have preferred a 50% split between men and women, but it just turns out that for that study, 80% happened to be women, but the age range was a nice spread in age, from 18 to 72 years of age. Yeah. For the control, you heard the synthesized voice. That was the voice that was used in all of the studies.
Which
it was
was
a
a
sort of
voice.
quasi-female, mechanical, robot-y kind of sounding voice.
The reason I ask you is because women are more conscious about their appearance, I think, than men are when they get to a certain age. So the follow-on question was going to be about the age range you used, and that women are more conscious, so they're more willing to make that effort. And if you had another woman there beside them helping them along, well, then it was kind of girl power sort of thing, if you know what I mean. And I was just wondering, did that have any impact on the study you were doing? The other thing you spoke about was touch and how important was touch. And you were talking about the handshake, particularly, because I was interested in this because there was a research done by a group of researchers in Iowa University, and they had 200 students who were going through an interview process. And they had handshake experts watching the students as they went through the interview process. And they hadn't been told about this, and they were watching to see how and when would they shake hands and who would shake hands. And they found that the people who gave the firm handshake, the men, all got the jobs, and the women who gave the firm handshake, the women all got the jobs, and the ones who had the weak handshakes at the interviews, no matter what else they did, just for some reason didn't get the jobs. And they concluded that touch was very important and handshake was very important, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm sure as you go down the road with your research, and you're looking at this already, because it was leaping to my mind as I was seeing it on the screen there, how important this sense of touch is and how important the human figure is, which is why you don't just put in the PC, which is why it has to have some kind of form and shape. But why didn't you dress them?
Why didn't we dress them?
The kind of people had dressed them.
Yeah,
why didn't you dress them?
People have been raising that question about, are all these robots naked? And, I guess we haven't really, we're just starting to now appreciate how much people want to adorn these systems. So people talk about cell phones, and you personalize them, you put in your different covers and so forth. People like to adorn these robots as well. So I guess for us, when we put these cosmetic shells on, in some sense, we kind of see that as, I guess, as some form of like donning, some sort of covering on them. But I think you're right. I think clothing is culturally, it's another really fascinating
because I'm assuming
topic.
that you showed some snaps of
robot
people
with a tie,
who would put a hat on and
versus
stuff.
a robot with a backwards baseball cap.
They were the people who had
Those were
these
the people
in their
who were
homes.
dressing them.
So they wanted to relate to them. You could see that was screaming out that, actually, this has become my mate, or I want to make this more human-like, so I'm going to do this. But I just wonder why.
A lot of Boston Red Sox caps on the robots.
Yeah. you could have dressed them and sent them out dressed.
We could have, but
that's
then
why
people.
I just why you didn't.
Right. Basically because we didn't even think about it. But I think the advantage of letting people do it themselves is that they could personalize it.
Yeah.
So that's probably something that you actually want to let people do for themselves. It's almost kind of like when you look at these human-human interaction studies and they look at personality types, that people tend to prefer people with similar personality traits and so forth. Robots might have greater acceptance if you're allowed to customize them in a way that fits into your home decor, your culture you're coming from, and so forth. So
that's what I was going to ask you about next was personality traits, because there's a program on, I think it's Discovery Living or something, which is when animals go bad. You see it and the animals turn on the keepers or whatever. And I just wondering what happens when robots go bad. And when these robots move on to a stage where they all develop their own little personalities, and some of them will be a little bit nasty. I'm thinking Brenda, who I work with, has this sonic device in the car that makes her aware when she's going to back up and reverse into something. It goes beep, 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 if she's going to collide with something. So she turned it off one day. And what happened the next day? She actually hit the wall, which she was reversing in. Okay, stupid thing. She said she can't reverse anyway. But I'm just wondering, will robots in time develop that kind of trick sense of humor, if you like? Okay, if you're not interested in what I have to say, okay, shag it. You know what I mean?
I think, again, it's what we're finding from human psychology as well as from human-computer interaction that, people pick up on these cues in a really, nuanced way, whether you intended to design them in or not. So I suspect, people assigned a personality to Autumn that we didn't necessarily intentionally try to craft that model in people's heads, but just through their interaction with it, they developed a personality for the robot. Again, depending on the goals you would have for interacting with the system, you might be the kind of person where you want the drill sergeant robot because that's what's going to help you get your results, whereas other people might want the sort of empathetic, caring robot because that's what's going to connect to them more. I think, these are all intriguing questions that we're just starting to look at.
But the robot learns that the guy has put the biscuits over there, the cookies over there, he's done this, he's done that. So then it can develop almost a mind of its own. It sounds ridiculous. I find it hard to believe that I'm saying it myself. But if it can figure out, if it can reason, as you've demonstrated, and I have to believe what I'm saying, then that's not such a huge leap of the imagination, is it?
I don't think it's, we've certainly have been imagining it for thousands of years, so it's not that leap of imagination. I think, a lot of this work, I think a lot of what makes robotics intriguing is that because of science fiction and movies, people have very strong opinions about what robots are and what they could be before they ever really even existed. So, in the United States, the first thing people think about is Terminator, If you go to Japan, the iconic robot figure is Atom Boy, which is a fundamentally benevolent robot. So you go to Japan and there's tremendous acceptance of robots. Of course they see robots as being benevolent entities. So, your question is a very typical question for Western culture, where we've grown up with this sort of suspicion and this sort of fear of these technologies. And I just want to highlight this is a cultural thing. It's not a universal thing. I think in a lot of movies, if you talk about inspiration from science fiction, it's because the machines can't relate to us and don't care about us. It's that because we're kind of the superfluous or annoying thing that's just getting in their way, that's why they discard us. Whereas my work is really taking the opposite view, which is if robots can actively relate to us and empathize with us and sympathize with us, then they can become more socialized in society. And that's a very kind of science fiction-y kind of idea.
And learn to get the better of us. No, I'm joking.
Well, I think a lot of that's socialization too, because kids, so if you look at children, right at the same time where they're exhibiting really heartwarming forms of empathy and thoughtfulness, they're also learning how to trick you.
Yeah.
It's the same cognitive competence that's being played out in two different ways. So that's where the teaching of values and norms and it becomes important, but that's a very social process. So, I think there's a bigger question of, what kinds of robots are we going to have in the future. I think we're going to have many, many, many different kinds, and I just threw up some slides showing you the many, many different kinds of robots. I think, it's going to be us as a society to try to understand what is the appropriate relationship of people to these kinds of technologies, what's the appropriate kind of responsibilities that you want to assign to them, and vice versa, and have that be an informed discussion, because I think from the scientific side, we have to understand these things in order for us to start to be able to make, informed judgments of what's the appropriate role. So even things like trust, the fact that you can vary these nonverbal cues to affect how much people trust these robots. The reason why that's important is because you want to design them so that people have appropriate trust, right? So it's all about trying to understand it first so that you understand how to responsibly design them. And I think that's a really
Android I saw for the
important
first time, James May on BBC Two, who presents a program called Top Gear. You may not be familiar with him, but he's done this kind of journey of discovery as to how far robots have come. And that was the first time I saw the Android. It was about 2 months ago on TV. But at what stage do controls come in?
Do controls?
Controls. I mean, you're working away. I mean, I couldn't believe when I saw that program 2 months ago how far it's come. And watching this today is another eye-opener for me. What stage do governments step in and control, or do you have a carte blanche? I mean, is there an endless...
Well, I think
pocket there of money for you?
I mean, so in the United States, stem cell research is, one of the big hot areas. So I think basically when it's raised as mini technologies is something that needs to be carefully considered, and is starting to get out to affect, products and so forth. Then I think, it has to enter into the dialogue. I think right now, we're still a long way off, frankly.
Yeah.
Progress is exciting, but we're still a long way off. And it's really much more about the basic science and the research to try to understand it and understand how people interact with things so that we can make informed decision about how it makes sense to design and what kinds of roles and so forth these machines should have in the future, if any. So I've shown you research from robots as just a pure communication medium all the way to stuff like Leonardo, which is a fully autonomous robot. And you can imagine there's a whole range and more of possible roles and applications in between. But what's important is to have the dialogue, and I think what's important is to communicate the questions and what we're learning, and again, I think it's significant to highlight what we're learning about people too, because again, we've been trying to build these machines in sort of our image for hundreds of years. If every new technology, we up the ante, so like, you talk about when the first people are starting to be able to build these very fine gear mechanisms, that's when you started to see the first ancient automaton, like the Vacanson duck and so forth. And then over time, the mechanical computer came into play, and you started to see these more sophisticated abilities. And then the electrical computer came. And so it's almost like with every new technology, we're able to push this area of inquiry even further. And I think the reason why we do that, a lot of it is because through this process, we're trying to understand ourselves. We're trying to think about ourselves and use this endeavor, I think, as a scientific pursuit, and in some cases probably a philosophical pursuit, to try to grapple with what does it mean to be human, what are humans becoming, what do we want to be in the future. And science fiction does the same thing, right? Science fiction uses robots as a sort of foil.
I think science fiction now has to catch up, to be honest with you.